While working on my series on parasocial relationships, I ended up getting deeper into robotics than I ever wanted to, and bumped up against a concept that I'd always found really interesting but had never researched in much detail: the Uncanny Valley. I've been meaning to write a horror theory series anyway, and the Uncanny Valley is a great place to start, both as a well-known concept that deserves further elaboration and examination, and as a companion piece to the parasocial series, so welcome to Horror Theory. This is a series that will serve as an excuse for me to talk about one of my favorite topics, horror, and draw attention to and support and/or challenge a variety of horror-related theory that I feel is worth talking about.
The robot's face is made of silicon plastic, and it can show emotions through facial expressions and head movements.
Webcomic artist Kelly Turnbull drew an image that sums up the Uncanny Valley perfectly. It's a simplified version of the original graph Masahiro Mori made in his essay that introduced the phenomenon, and it uses the spectrum of toaster to human to illustrate it. Basically, humans have an affinity for things that are a cute, cartoonish, or unrealistic representation of a person. Here, Turnbull uses the brave little toaster as an example. The toaster has emotions and is expressive, but obviously isn't trying to trick us into thinking it's human, so we aren't threatened or creeped out at all. On the opposite end, we also have an affinity for real people, like Marlon Brando, who we can relate to and understand as a person. But as you get closer and closer to a realistic representation of a person, there's a huge dip in affinity where we get creeped out. Things look off. Something is almost human but not quite, before affinity goes back up when you hit actual person. That's the Uncanny Valley. The idea that something that tries to be human and gets close but fails freaks us out way more than something that doesn't try very hard, with the valley being the dip in the graph between the first and second peaks. The Uncanny Valley is not a particularly obscure idea, but I wanted to start my series on horror theory with it because 1. Its history, including faulty translations, outside challenges to the concept, some researchers even insisting that it doesn't exist, and the ways in which Mori has changed his mind over the years, are all very interesting and aren't nearly as well known as the concept itself. 2. Like I said, it serves as a great companion piece to my parasocial series, being that it's hard to form a relationship with an almost human entity if it creeps you out too much for you to want to get close to it. 3. I felt that there are applications of the theory outside of representing just humans, and that something in the valley can elicit emotions other than affinity or fear. And 4, I think that there are ways in which the theory contributes harmful ideas to our society that go unchallenged. Just generally, I wanted to both flesh out the concept and provide an alternative perspective. Let's backtrack real fast 40 or 50 years. In 1970, Masahiro Mori published Bukimi no Tani Gensho, an essay about a perceived phenomenon in robotics he assumed would one day be a problem. He called the phenomenon the Bukimi no Tani, Bukimi meaning eerie and Tani meaning valley. The word uncanny and its connotations became attached separately in 1978, and they were never an intended inclusion by Mori. The first English translation of his essay was also a rush job done in 2005 in about an hour, 42 years after it was initially published. The essay did not get a more comprehensive, accurate, and Mori-approved English version until 2012, and this translation only used the word uncanny because of established familiarity with the term in association with the theory. Uncanny and eerie aren't that different in definition, but I thought that it was interesting that arguably the most well-known use of the word uncanny in English, and the resulting connections to Freud, Lacan, and others, came about as a mistake. Another aspect lost in the initial translation, or in oversimplifications of the concept, is Shinwakan, roughly translated as affinity. Carl McDorman, who worked on both the rushed 2005 translation and on the more accurate 2012 one, said this about the concept of Shinwakan. I think it is that feeling of being in the presence of another human being. The moment when you feel in synchrony with someone other than yourself and experience a meeting of minds. Negative Shinwakan, the uncanny, is when that sense of synchrony falls apart. The moment you discover that the one you thought was your soulmate was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. This is certainly a more complicated concept than our affinity for an object. In an interview from 2012, Mori said, "Since I was a child, I have never liked looking at wax figures. They look somewhat creepy to me. At the time, electronic prosthetic hands were being developed, and they triggered in me the same kind of sensation. These experiences had made me start thinking about robots in general, which led me to write this essay. The Uncanny Valley was my intuition." When asked about the initial response to his essay, Mori said, "You could say that there was no response. The seriousness of both his ideas and of robotics themselves were initially met with derision. Mori said, "In those days, people didn't think universities should be doing research on robots. They thought that it was frivolous to be working on a toy. As with anything new, there was much opposition, and I felt that everyone was against me." Mori also devotes an entire section to how movement affects an object or creature's placement on the valley, devoting a second line on the graph to it, so a full understanding of his theory as initially published must take movement, not just aesthetics, into account. On places like 4chan, copypasta referred to something copied and pasted again and again. So creepypasta was an extension of the phrase referring to short, simple horror stories designed to be shared over and over, usually written and posted anonymously. Around 2009 to 2011, I was really into creepypasta and even put out one of my own. The culture of creepypasta has since changed a lot, and I have not kept up with it at all, but I remember one from back then called Genetic Memory pretty clearly, due to me having seen it pop up again and again years ago, and because of how short, simple, and effective it is. Here it is in its entirety. Many classic horror icons, such as Giger's xenomorphs, Silent Hill's Pyramid Head, and other disturbing creatures, share common characteristics. Pale skin, dark, sunken eyes, elongated faces, sharp teeth, and the like. These images inspire horror and revulsion in many, and with good reason. The characteristics shared by these faces are imprinted on the human mind. Many things frighten humans instinctively. The fear is natural and does not need to be reinforced in order to terrify. The fears are species-wide, stemming from dark times in the past, when lightning could mean the burning of your tree home, thunder could be the approaching gallops of a stampede, predators could hide in darkness, and heights could make poor footing lethal. The question you have to ask yourself is this: what happens deep in the hidden eras before history began that could affect the entire human race so evenly as to give the entire species a deep, instinctual, and lasting fear of pale beings with dark sunken eyes, razor-sharp teeth, and elongated faces? Just be careful out there. I think it's a well-written creepypasta, but what is centrally proposed as a haunting question, in reality, has a flat, obvious answer. What it describes are either characteristics of predators or characteristics of dead or diseased human beings. The idea of all of these characteristics being compiled into some ancient, forgotten monster is creepy, but it falls apart pretty quickly since they're all inherently creepy by themselves. In Mori's original essay about the valley, he said, "Why were we equipped with this eerie sensation? Is it essential for human beings? I have not yet considered these questions deeply, but I have no doubt it is an integral part of our instinct for self-preservation." As a note, he added that the sense of eeriness is probably a form of instinct that protects us from proximal rather than distal sources of danger. Proximal sources of danger are corpses, members of different species, and other entities we can closely approach. Distal sources of danger include windstorms and floods. It's striking to me that this essay from the 70s has a similar thought process to an unrelated creepypasta written many years later. And I was reminded of this concept while researching the Uncanny Valley, because there's been a struggle to get to the bottom of why what resides in the valley creeps us out so much. It doesn't help that the idea itself initially came from a simple proposed hypothesis with no experiments or studies to back it up that was mostly just ignored for years without catching on. Mori said, "Pointing out the existence of the Uncanny Valley was more a piece of advice from me to people who design robots rather than a scientific statement." He did explicitly mention horror, though, saying that the idea of mannequins moving would be like a horror story. This was something my friends and I exploited for a short film, one where my friend Devon makes fun of an ominous mannequin head.
This is so stupid.
And is then cursed. Mori also talked about how the speed of a robot's smile can take it from happy to creepy. In my video games essay, I referenced a part of a Silent Hill 2 making of documentary that describes how the game also mines this to evoke unease in players. The designers on that game made human-esque monsters, then deliberately undercut their humanity, including by giving them unnatural, jerky movements.
人間のパーツをそのモンスターのどこかに必ずこう取り入れて、でそこからプレイヤーがそのモンスターを見てできるだけ元は人なんだっていうところをこう想像させた上で、そこでそのモンスターが人間とはちょっと違うこう例えば体が折れすぎてしまうとか、その這いつくばって早くこう移動すると であるとか、そういうギャップにしたんで、例えばこう酔っ払ってる人とかはこう普段とちょっと違う動きとかしますよね。でそういう意味ではそれに類する、例えばこうなんかちっちゃい子がこう頭が大きいからこうバランス崩して歩くとか、そういったのを主に参考に。
In 2014, Katja Zibrick and Rachel McDonnell used the same motion capture recordings to animate 2 different avatars, with this one described as highly appealing, friendly, and familiar, being found preferable to this one, designed to have the appearance of disease, and which was rated as both unappealing and eerie, particularly when moving, with the exact same animations and audio. The difference was especially apparent when the personalities that Ill Style was trying to act out were agreeableness and conscientiousness. In fact, Angela Tinwell, Mark Grimshaw, and Andrew Williams published a piece called Uncanny Behavior in Survival Horror Games in 2010. The study indicated that attributes of motion and sound do exaggerate the uncanny phenomenon and how frightening that character is perceived to be. Strong correlations were identified for the perceived strangeness of a character with how human-like a character's voice sounded, how human-like the facial expression appeared, and how synchronized the character's sound was with lip movement. Characters rated as the least synchronized were perceived to be the most frightening. They mentioned how a 2006 tech demo for Heavy Rain featured a character with off-sync lip synchronization that was unintentionally interpreted as creepy and uncanny.
My name is Mary Smith. I'm 24.
Have you ever taken any acting lessons, Mary?
Not really. I couldn't afford it, but I watch a lot of films and I learn so much by watching them.
Have you shot anything recently?
They also cited a 2000 book by Robert Spadoni called Uncanny Bodies. Uncanny Bodies posits that the shift from silent to sound film was jarring to audiences and both unintentionally added to the horror of those films and influenced film from then on. I haven't read the book, but I have read the essay Spadoni published first titled The Uncanny Body of Early Sound Film. In this essay, he quoted James O. Spearing, who in 1928 said, "When orchestral accompaniments and the noises of such things as steam engines, horses' hoofs, gunfire, and the like were synchronized with pictures, nobody became alarmed. They were an addition, that's all. But when screen actors began to speak lines, the silent drama was attacked. Voices invaded its peculiar domain." Spadoni described, quote, "the viewer's renewed awareness of the mechanical nature of the cinema, stemming from issues from the period of transition between silent and sound, and also the initial sensational novelty appeal of synchronized sound film. Spadoni referred to this as medium sensitivity. On top of a general heightened awareness brought on by the novelty of a massive technological shift were issues like synchronization problems. Similar to the Heavy Rain example in video games, unintentional sync issues made characters dip into the Uncanny Valley, both by reminding viewers of their unreality and distance from an actual, present, physical person, such as an actual actor on stage rather than a projected one on a flat screen, and by mismatching sound and movement again being important to Maury's essay. Even well-synced early sound recordings sounded eerie and artificial.
Mary had a little lamb, its feet were white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
Due both to limited technology and audiences having trouble taking in sound that came from a centralized place, rather than directly from the on-screen character's mouth, something we, today, no longer struggle with as spectators. He said, synchronized speech could be exhilarating, arrestingly so, and also by virtue of its newness had the power to make viewers uncomfortable, and that sound resensitized viewers to the visual image. He quoted a review of The Jazz Singer from 1930, saying that the need for actors to stay close to hidden microphones, keep still, and enunciate clearly made the players resemble figures in a wax museum. He speaks of imperfect sound technology that many believed was never more imperfect than when it was reproducing the human voice. Spadoni quoted others describing characters in early sound films as ghostly and spooky, as film, quote, took what was widely perceived to be a major step towards a fuller representation of reality, it simultaneously became more unreal, evoking a resemblance to a living human corpse. He suggested that Universal's Dracula and Frankenstein benefited from the uncanny nature of early sound film, saying, "The pioneers at Universal were filmmakers, but they were also film viewers. Their experiences as such might have influenced the choices they made as they brought to semi-life those first undead creatures of the sound era." It's cool that wax figures and corpses were brought up in relation to films from the 1920s and the 1930s, being that they're both, again, central to Maury's essay. Just in general, I'm not going to go super into detail with regard to the 2012 translation of Maury's original essay. since the basic concept is so well known and the essay is so short and accessible. I'll of course link it in the description, but it's easy to Google and it's only a few pages long and it's really easy to read and understand. The key points to take from his essay are the basic graph, the graph including movement, and the fact that he recommends designers aim for the first peak rather than attempting the second and failing. I would propose 2 additions to his theory as it stands. 1, the Uncanny Valley can elicit feelings other than fear, and 2, it does not apply only to that which is almost human. Regarding the spectrum of inhuman and unrealistic versus human, I've seen a juxtaposition of the two played up as a gag in anime and manga. Yakitate Japan has a character named Brad Kidd, an obvious homage to Brad Pitt, whose strikingly realistic features are comically out of place among more stylized faces.
私はきっとマッサージ師さ。マッサージ師？ああ。
And in Great Teacher Onizuka, the main character's reaction shots are rendered in a grotesque, realistic style in contrast to his normally more stylized appearance. Cromartie High School has a fairly realistic art style, but it's a comedy. The contrast between absurd situations and more realistic faces is played up for laughs. One Punch Man's art style, while not photorealistic, is detailed and carefully rendered. But for some reaction shots, the main character regresses to an oval face for comedic effect. The Uncanny Valley is built to describe something almost human but not human enough, and proposed explanations tend to focus on the human aspect of the theory. On my second point, the computer animation and special effects section of the wiki page for the Uncanny Valley mentions Susanna Polo's review of the live-action Avatar movie where Appa looks creepy because, quote, prey animals, like bison, have eyes on the sides of their heads, so moving them to the front without changing the rest of the facial structure tips us right into the Uncanny Valley. Bad taxidermy is unsettling and uncomfortable in precisely the same way faux humans that fall into the Uncanny Valley are. It's hardly a leap to compare a poorly constructed taxidermy rendering of an animal to a creepy animatronic non-person. Kelly Turnbull talked about this on the page with the Toaster comic. It reads, if you want something non-human to emote like a human, you can't just slap human eyes on it and call it a day. Back in the day, sometime in first-year animation class, we were doing 4-legged animal walk cycles of animals randomly chosen out of a hat. The teacher warned us that people who got things like cats and dogs were probably going to have a harder time than people who got things like bears and raccoons, because people are so familiar with those animals that they'll always notice right away if something looks wrong. This goes for anything people have a point of reference for. I would assume that furry art wouldn't be quite as popular as it is if the cute cartoon girls were replaced with realistic human-animal mashups, at least. Turnbull is talking generally about humans and human-animal combinations, but it works when applied to representations of animals, especially, as Turnbull says, ones that we are familiar with. For my parasocial essays, I learned a lot about Paro, the robotic therapy seal. Paro is cute, cartoonish, unrealistic, and based on an animal most people wouldn't have seen or held in person. Cheaper animatronic therapy animals modeled after animals humans are more familiar with, like cats and dogs, register more complaints about them being creepy and robotic. One review for a therapeutic robot cat on Amazon says, simply, I returned it and I am still waiting for my refund. The cat was very scary. I also have a fascination with what are called stealth sites. A cell tower is also known as a cell site, and cell sites that are disguised as something other than cell sites are called stealth sites. I find them weird and creepy and funny. To me, they look like aliens tried to design a tree that blended in with the rest of the landscape, and it failed completely. Others are also sensitive to this uncanny weirdness stealth sites have about them. The Conspiracy Tree Tower is a short piece about a stealth site that elicited fear and paranoia in InfoWars types. A blog post by a Georgia resident written in 2011 entitled, That's No Tree, That's a Cell Tower, states that, originally conceived as an attempt to make telecommunications towers more compatible with their surrounding environments, these structures have become integrated into popular culture because the tree towers create more of a visual impact than ordinary tower structures. It mentions a band called Frankenpine, and says that a designer of one of these sites said, what we try to do the best we can is to blend in. One person the blogger spoke to said, it's quite cool that they disguised it as a tree, and it stands out. It's not very attractive. The unease I feel when looking at an Uncanny Valley object is often coupled with humor. It's a juxtaposition of feelings in sort of the same way as saying something is both quite cool and not very attractive. Faulty animatronics and bad taxidermy are often played for laughs, with a similar juxtaposition to the one I mentioned being mined in anime. And a local park association president interviewed by the blogger described how she and her husband laughed about the fake tree stealth site. For some reason that is difficult to articulate, even as a huge animal lover, I find taxidermied animals attached to drones hysterical. Many others have a less positive response and find them disrespectful and offensive.
I think they should let the cat rest in peace. That's crazy.
Which is, of course, completely understandable. By limiting the emotion studied to fear or unease and limiting the subjects to objects that are human-like, we limit ourselves in the exploration of this concept. I admit this is getting outside of Maury's intended purview somewhat, but when research is limited to one aspect of a phenomenon as justification for the phenomenon, there are bound to be missing pieces. In fact, one of my favorite pieces of horror theory, Noel Carroll's ideas about the liminal, which I referenced in my Hannibal essay and which boiled down to, that which violates cultural boundaries is often treated with reactionary disgust, definitely apply here, and are a topic that I plan to devote a future horror theory video essay to. Many explanations for the Uncanny Valley hinge on why we find an almost human eerie. Just from the wiki page, mate selection, mortality salience, pathogen avoidance. I even found a study that linked uncanny feelings with perceptions of virtual characters that had poorly animated facial expressions because to the players, they read as psychopaths. But, while these are all certainly valid ideas that amplify the sense of eeriness felt when confronted with an almost human, the focus should be on finding almost anything we are familiar with scary, with humans just happening to be what we are most familiar with. I'm not the only person who has taken issue with Maury's essay. David Hansen, Andrew Olney, Ismar A. Pereira, and Marge Zilka published Upending the Uncanny Valley in 2005. Their piece is the one I've seen most referenced as a counter-argument to the theory. Rigorous examination of any theory is, of course, both admirable and necessary, but I don't buy most of their ideas or comparisons. They bring up Greek sculpture and Rodin's Thinker and Mary Cassatt's baby paintings as examples of accepted great and important works, but I'd argue that sculptures don't fit Maury's definition of the valley, especially since they are absent any movement. And even though they're still, these baby paintings are, in fact, kind of creepy. They also claim that their Philip K. Dick robot contradicts the Uncanny Valley, but while looking for video of their supposedly revolutionary android, one of the first things that popped up was a YouTube video titled Freaky AI Robot. Other uploads on YouTube had comments like, "Laugh while you can. This makes me so uncomfortable. Evil version of Jarvis. Its eyes, they just don't look right. Why would you connect that shit to the internet? They laughed at his answers. He'll laugh at their funerals. Y'all laugh now, but you'll regret missing the warning signs in your people pins." And I don't think so. One of the videos uploaded has this description. This is a video of me at Next Fest in Chicago 2005 talking to Philip K. Dick Android. He did not want to stop looking at me or talking to me, and I just read on the internet that someone has stolen him. What if he escaped and is coming to get me? Some people thought it was funny rather than creepy or felt a combination of the two, the same way I describe my own reactions to Uncanny Valley objects. Either way, for a lot of spectators, it was a failed representation of a human being, and it elicited revulsion and fear, derision, or both. Compare this to YouTube videos featuring therapy seal robot Paro, who has a much more favorable reaction, with most people calling it cute or adorable. I agree, though, with their assertion that there is little to lose by making robots uncanny and much to gain in our understanding of humans and human emulation, and that realistic robots are enticing simply as an underexplored territory in robotics. The piece contains admirable effort towards reaching a comfortable level of realism in robots, rather than conceding to an insurmountable valley. I also like the assertion that anthropomorphic depictions can be disturbing or appealing at every level of abstraction or realism. People simply get more sensitive with increasing levels of realism. This reminded me of much of what Spadoni said about film technology. That the discursive element that was new raised awareness of the remaining silences and blank spots of the total sensory package. And the perceptions that could result had the power to infiltrate and counteract viewers' sense of the general advancement of the medium toward greater realism. And that conflicting perceptual cues clashed in the minds of viewers, who are trying to make sense of a new representational technology. This seems to apply just as well to early sound film as it applies to robots from now into the future, with the connecting thread being technological advancement of representations of how humans move and speak. It's not that out there to assume that as we become culturally acclimated to new almost but not quite humans, the way we did with speaking humans on screen, we'll find them less creepy. Thoughtful insight and admirable effort don't make their Philip K. Dick android any less creepy, though, and their evidence is not compelling enough. This spectrum that they provide as a supposed takedown of the theory is not nearly as representative of the Uncanny Valley as Turnbull's toaster spectrum, despite the fact that these are serious robotics researchers, and Turnbull is a storyboard and webcomic artist. Carl McDorman, one of the people who worked on the 2012 translation who I mentioned earlier, has also worked on a ton of research on the Uncanny Valley.
Why are we so sensitive to flaws in human-like forms? Well, there are a number of possible theories for explaining this. One is based on expectation violation, the violation of human norms. Near human forms elicit our model of a human other, but the model's predictions mismatch the stimuli. It doesn't measure up. So, for example, we could have a kind of cross-modal mismatch when you see a hand that looks like a real hand, but you touch it and it feels cold and clammy. It feels hard and mechanical. You could have temporal mismatches. For example, the android may produce very fluid movements and suddenly it jerks. You have some kind of give or feedback in the system. There's also issues of contingency. It may behave very naturally, but asks you a question and it takes too long to give a response when you speak back to it. That seems unnatural. So this is another way of violating human norms. Another issue about androids is that they're very strange. We didn't grow up or evolve in a world that had androids, that had these objects that are actually electromechanical but look like human beings. So they're on a kind of category boundary. It's in this liminal area between human and machine. And because they look like us, they could call our personal identity into question. If they're really effective at imitating people, then it could make us wonder, well, aren't we all just machines? Does that leave space for the soul, for example?
He has more than 20 papers listed on his website under that category. I haven't read or sorted through all of them, but of particular interest is The Uncanny Advantage of Using Androids in Cognitive and Social Science Research, a paper he published with Hiroshi Ishiguro. Ishiguro is a roboticist who designed an android, named Geminoid, after himself, and has more than once gotten plastic surgery to look more like Geminoid. There are two spectrums presented in this essay. The images, quote, morph from a mechanical-looking humanoid on the left, to an android in the center, to a human being on the right, and chart human likeness, familiarity, and eeriness. They're a more rigorous and intellectually honest representation of Mori's theory than the other study, and their findings support his hypothesis. Not every study of McDorman's replicates the valley, though. For instance, another one suggests that human likeness is only one of perhaps many factors influencing the extent to which a robot is perceived as being strange, familiar, or eerie. A study he did with Stephen O. Intezari on how individual differences, such as religious belief, gender, personality, etc., influence sensitivity to the Uncanny Valley, suggests that the Uncanny Valley phenomenon may operate through both sociological constructs and biological adaptations for threat avoidance, such as the fear and disgust systems. My conclusion after researching, and just generally as a human who feels something between knee-jerk suspicion towards that which would fall into the Uncanny Valley and knee-jerk derision towards it, is that the Uncanny Valley is only one aspect of our distrust of that which we perceive as not necessarily just interstitial, as in between two established states, the states here being human and not human, but both interstitial and attempting to be something we are very familiar with, but just falling short as a threat. It just so happens that human beings, our faces, how we move, how we speak, are what we're familiar with above all else. And Mori himself in the original essay recounts disgust at a prosthetic hand. As with any culturally or even instinctually ingrained disgust or fear reaction, it's valuable for us to accurately and objectively assess it and how it affects us, so that it does not lead to bigotry or fear. There's nothing wrong with feeling freaked out over an android or a CGI character, but there's obvious harm in dismissing other human beings because they don't fit an idealized standard of what we see as human, whether it's because of illness or disability or whatever else. Remember that Zibrick and McDonald deliberately used an ill avatar for the creepy one, even though Mori placed an ill person fairly high up on his valley. This line of thought also reminds me of this clip of Hayao Miyazaki.
これ踊ってるように見えますけど、でこれは早く移動するっていうのを学習させたやつなんですね。これ頭を使って移動してるんですけど、基本痛覚とかないし、頭が大事だとかっていう概念がないし、だからもう頭をもう普通の足のように使って移動してるっていう。この動きがとにかく気持ち悪いので。ゾンビゲームの動きに使えるんじゃないかっていうこういう人工知能を使うと 多分人間が想像できない気持ち悪い動きができるんじゃないか、一応こんなことをやっています。実際には
毎朝この頃会わないけど身体障害の友人がいるんですよ。そのハイタッチするんだけども大変なんです。彼の筋肉がこわばってる手と僕の手でこうハイタッチするで、その彼のことを思い出してね、僕はこれ面白いと思って見ることできないですよ。これを作る人たちは痛みとかそういうものについてね、何も考えないでやってるでしょ。極めて不愉快ですよね。そんなに気持ち悪いものをやりたいなら勝手にやってればいいだけで、僕はこれを自分たちの仕事をつなげたいとは全然思いません。極めて何か生命に対する侮辱を感じます。
I would hate to be someone with a top-of-the-line prosthetic hand that increased my quality of life and obviously posed no threat whatsoever to the people around me, only to sit down and read Maury's description of how my hand would make healthy people feel uneasy, and how a woman would assuredly shriek if she touched it in a dark room. When asked about whether people should reach beyond the valley, Maury says, "I always tell them to stop there. Why do you have to take the risk and try to get closer to the other side? It's not even interesting to develop a robot that looks exactly like a human from my perspective. And I have no motivation to build a robot that resides on the other side of the valley. I think the design of Asimo is more invigorating. I feel that robots should be different from human beings." Oddly enough, in this same interview, he says that the Uncanny Valley first started to receive attention outside of Japan at the IEEE Robotics and Automation Society International Conference on Humanoid Robots in 2005. Maury was not able to attend that event. This interview links to what seems to be a statement written by Maury in lieu of his attendance. Here's part of the statement. Here I make two brief comments on this subject from my present point of view to make up for my absence. 1. A dead person's face may indeed be uncanny. It loses color in animation with no blinking. However, according to my experience, sometimes it gives us a more comfortable expression than the one given by a living person's face. Dead persons are free from the troubles of life, and I think this is the reason why their faces look so calm and peaceful. In our mind, there is always an intimate conflict, that if you take one thing, you will lose the other. Such a conflict appears on one's face as troubles and makes his or her expression less comfortable. When a person dies, he or she is released from this antinomy and has a quiet expression. If so, then where should we position this on the curve of the Uncanny Valley? This is an issue of my current interest. 2. Once I position human beings on the highest point of the curve in the right-hand side of the Uncanny Valley. Recently, however, I came to think that there is something more attractive and amiable than human beings in the further right-hand side of the valley. It is the face of a Buddhist statue as the artistic expression of the human ideal. He gives some examples, and then he says, "Those faces are full of elegance, beyond the worries of life, and have an aura of dignity. I think those are the very things that should be positioned on the highest point of the curve. While I introduced the notion of the Uncanny Valley, I have not examined it closely so far. I hope the above-mentioned two respects will help the further research of the Uncanny Valley." In the 2012 interview as well, when asked directly about projects aiming beyond the valley, he says, "I wouldn't say that there are many, but yes, there are some, and that's fine. Although I do think it's difficult. Using the wood carving of a Buddha statue as an example, that one last touch of the knife may destroy the whole thing. There is a narrow margin for error. Especially because I'm only able to read sources in English, not Japanese, and because of my lack of familiarity with Buddhism, which so much of Maury's life outlook and further research is tied to, it's difficult to track the fluctuations in Maury's beliefs around the Uncanny Valley. But I wanted to present as much as I could of his ideas outside of the 1970 essay. His ruminations on the peace and beauty of a dead body suggest at least somewhat of an increased capacity for affinity for that which is outside of cultural norms, and his reverence for what lies beyond the second peak and dismissal of that which is trying to replicate humans runs counter to what many roboticists are still desperately striving for. There is a ton of research I haven't covered, and I admit that I probably have some blind spots. Unlike film theory, which I've studied for years, I'm not exactly an expert when it comes to robotics, and most of what I talk about here, regardless of how important it is in the evolution of the theory, is several years old and could be outdated. Feel free to suggest counterarguments and further research. I would like to one day do an expanded essay on the uncanny outside of human representation, robotics, and Maury's general definition as well. Check out the upcoming part 2 of my parasocial relationship series where, among a bunch of other stuff, I'm going to talk about different robots and their relationships with humans. Most of the ones that humans forge relationships with aren't very uncanny, as it turns out. If you'd like to hear me talk about Noel Carroll and interstitiality in more detail, check out my Hannibal essay. And check out whatever essay I'll eventually devote entirely to the concept. If you have some spare money, please consider donating to my Patreon. It's support on Patreon that gives me the time to do research for essays like this one. Thanks for watching!